We've always believed in having a limited lifetime, but we've actually now made it specifically 20 years.
The Gates Foundation says it'll shut down in 20 years. During that time, they're pledging to spend $200 billion, almost double their giving to date. The announcement comes during a time of global pullback in aid. I sat down with Gates Foundation co-founder Bill Gates in February to talk about this momentous decision, how he and his colleagues got here, and what it means for the future of philanthropy and global aid.
Thanks for coming.
My great pleasure, I assure you.
Bill, you've got some big news to announce. What is it?
Well, the Gates Foundation is celebrating its 25th anniversary. We got started in the year 2000, and so far we've given away a little over $100 billion to the key causes. And we looked at, okay, what should our lifetime be? We've always believed in having a limited lifetime, but we've actually now made it specifically 20 years that we'll spend all of our resources. And so between the additional money that I'll put into the foundation and the money that's there, over these next 20 years, we'll spend a bit over $200 billion. And so we'll be able to spend at a pretty high rate, and that'll give us a chance to make a great deal of progress, we think, on the key issues.
This sounds unprecedented in a number of ways. One, I'm not aware of any significant foundation that has named an end date 20 years in the future. And the other thing that I think is unprecedented is simply the amount that you will have disbursed. Is that correct?
There have been spend down foundations. Most of the largest have had sort of indefinite timeframes. Rockefeller Foundation and others, were created a long time ago, and they're still doing great work. So for a foundation our size, this is unique. Yeah. And yes, it sets some records in terms of the amounts involved. Other people could later beat it. I hope they do. It's not meant to stand because others have more resources, and I'll be excited to see what they do.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned the Rockefeller Foundation. There's the Carnegie Foundation, both over 100 years old, and still, as you say, giving money to worthy causes. So why not do that?
Well, the Gates Foundation is fairly operational. That is, we built teams that are experts on malnutrition, malaria, contraception, and we fund both the research to create new products and get them to be very inexpensive. And then we partner with governments and other philanthropies to actually deliver those to where they're most needed. Likewise, in our education work, we fund a lot of R&D and then partner with the schools to actually try those things out. And, by spending the money sooner than later, it allows us to be very ambitious about getting polio eradication done. We hope in this time frame that malaria is either done or almost done. And we can kind of clarify, okay, here's what we've got, and say to other people, okay, we can't do these other things, so let's work together, because certainly both of our key areas, health and education, our resources are nowhere near enough to achieve what everybody should want the world to do.
You do have some tremendous ambition for things that you're trying to do, and on the way to doing. You mentioned polio could be eradicated not too far away from now, who knows. But there's also malaria, there's also tuberculosis, also HIV/AIDS. You would like to eradicate, or just about eradicate, there's only been one human disease that has been eradicated, smallpox, and that was many years ago. You think you can get, 3 or just about?
If you count things like guinea worm or lymphatic filariasis, we should be able to get probably 4 or 5. The big one, in addition to polio, would be malaria.
Right.
For all these delivery things, it's not just the Gates Foundation alone. We have rich world governments, particularly U.S. government, that has been very generous in many of these areas. On the research side, some things we're able to do the funding, but take polio, we've gotten up now to be almost half of that. Even there, we can't do it ourselves.
Am I correct that the Gates Foundation disburses more each year than any other philanthropic foundation?
Yeah, we've been the largest foundation since we were created in the year 2000. And so in the year 2000, I put $20 billion of stock into the foundation. And then the way the U.S. rules work, we had $1 billion a year minimum payout.
Right. You have to pay out 5%. Right?
Exactly. And so we've stayed well ahead of that 5%. We're, more like 10%. And then, of course, in 2006, Warren Buffett makes his unbelievably generous donation. And so he's a significant part of the resources we've gotten. So we worked our way up from that billion a year to now just about $9 billion is our current payout for 2025. Right. And so we'll go, it's 20 years, $200 billion, we'll be at about $10 billion a year. Right. There's a small footnote that if, markets, went way down, we'd have to adjust these numbers down. That's fortunately not too likely. Right. If markets were super generous, then we'd adjust them up a little bit. But the 20 years we're going to stick with.
Right. It sounds like part of the rationale for the 20-year end date is with regard to some of these things you've been working on. I'm thinking about these diseases in particular. You can see the end, right? We're not there, but you can see your way there. And you think that if you put a lot of money in every year for 20 years, that's the best way to achieve what you want. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And, this organization, which is as strong as any organization I've ever been involved with. I mean, Microsoft was great for software, and, in climate, I have a thing called Breakthrough Energy, for health and education, the incredible team of experts we built that fund the R&D and getting the costs down and working in partnership on delivery. It's an incredible group. And, I want to say to them, okay, you are fully funded for the next 20 years. We're going to have to be flat. So, every new thing we add, we'll have to prioritize that. And then, at the end of the 20 years, there will be many other rich people. They'll be more up to date about what governments are doing, what science is doing, how things are going in the poorer parts of Asia or Africa. And, they can step in and, using their skills and their resources and carry on whatever we're not able to finish.
Yeah. You have mentioned that in all you do, you have enlisted others to help with it. You have partnerships in many, many different ways. And this is an important thing because I imagine a lot of people think, well, gee, the Gates Foundation has a lot of money. They probably can do all this by themselves. But you have expanded what you're able to do by these partnerships. Can you kind of describe what they all are?
Well, the rich governments of the world typically have something like 1% of their budget set aside to help the poorest in the world. So for the United States, that would include the President's emergency plan for AIDS relief that President Bush initiated, which is almost $7 billion a year by itself. And overall global health aid from the U.S. is about $15 billion a year. And, so that money is going, just like the Gates Foundation money, to these heroes in the field that make sure that these, say, HIV drugs that we've gotten down to very low cost and reduce the side effects, fantastic things have happened there. But the Gates Foundation can't fund that delivery. We're a partner.
Right.
A good example of this is the group Gavi that buys vaccines for the poorest children in the world. That's the primary reason that Gavi's provided those vaccines. The biggest reason why childhood death has gone from over 10 million a year, the year the foundation has started, to now below 5 million. And so the Gates Foundation has been about 20% of that Gavi fund that's buying those vaccines. There's also the Global Fund, which is for HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria, and we've been about 7% of that. And the other 93% is almost entirely governments, European, Japan, the U.S. Has been very generous there. And so in no way are these miraculous results we've had in global health just us working on our own.
Right. The mention of Gavi is important because it enabled you to do something, you and many others, that wouldn't otherwise could have been done, which is to get it worth the while of the big pharma companies to make these vaccines at low price, right?
Yeah, so at the turn of the century, there's a rotavirus vaccine that is fairly expensive, and it's being given to kids in rich countries.
Right.
Now, kids in rich countries almost never die of diarrhea, but the vaccine's fine because they'll get sick a little bit less, go to the hospital a little bit less, so that's fine. But it's too expensive to be available. There's no funding, and the unit cost is too high. So as you create Gavi, you can get adoption and guarantee volume so that you bring in not only the rich world pharma companies to make higher volume and lower cost, but you also bring in developing world vaccine companies like Serum, Bharat, BioE, and we give them money up front, so they come up with a rotavirus vaccine. And so the price has gone from about $8 a dose to about $1.50 for this vaccine that prevents the primary cause of diarrhea. Rotavirus all over the world is the primary thing, and it often leads to death. In fact, we've cut diarrheal deaths in more than half, and that's because of the uptake of this rotavirus vaccine.
I was going to ask you, actually, whether this decline in child death over the past 25 years was, partly your result. And you go back even before the formal beginning of the foundation, right? Because I think that Gavi was being started around then, and you had a role.
Yeah, so the year 2000, we create the foundation.
Yeah.
And then in the next few years, we both are the founders of Gavi, because it makes sense. And we're also a founder of Global Fund, which is the multilateral for those three diseases. So if you look at our history, the 25 years, and you say, okay, what's the greatest thing you've done? There are many candidates, on the research side, but, probably in the top five are being a co-founder of Gavi and a co-founder of Global Fund, because, the end result, the ultimate goal, which is reducing deaths, not only under 5 deaths, but also all the deaths from TB, HIV, and malaria, that's been unbelievable that we've cut those in half across the board, even in Africa, where things are so difficult, particularly with HIV and malaria.
Yeah. Could you tell us basically where we stand right now with regard to polio, tuberculosis, malaria?
Yeah, so with polio, there's a campaign started by Rotary, US CDC, WHO and UNICEF back in 1988.
Yeah.
And their goal is to get done by the turn of the century.
Right.
We come in as that's ongoing and get very involved, hire some very expert people. We become the largest single donor to that effort. And we've had a lot of success. The only countries that we've never gotten rid of polio in are Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, we had it out of Africa, but it came back in Africa.
Right.
And so those are our two big focuses. Finish it in Asia and then go mop up Africa.
Right.
Now, whenever this virus is anywhere, it can spread back. So we had someone in New York got paralyzed. We had kids in Gaza got paralyzed. Right. We've gotten rid of it there, but we still have these two reservoirs.
Right.
And it's a very operational thing. You have to get these drops, these oral polio drops, to about 90% of the kids in order to have it go away. So whenever you have instability or bad rumors, it can be very difficult. But we think over the next 4 years we'll be able to solve both of the geographies.
Yeah, and just for perspective, how many total cases of polio do we think there are in the world right now?
We're down to hundreds of cases. The wild type in Asia is about 100, and then Africa, there's a few hundred. So we start at the eradication campaign where it's over 200,000 kids being paralyzed every year. So, we're down to this tiny amount. Sadly, getting that last amount is very difficult. And if you back off, then it can go back up because, this virus spreads very easily. So 0 is very much a magic number in eradication.
Wow. Tuberculosis, where are we?
Yeah, so TB, this is the infectious disease that actually kills the most people. COVID got ahead for a couple of years, but now TB at 1.3 million a year is the biggest infectious disease killer. It's amazing how little work has been done on any tools for TB diagnostics, drugs, and vaccines, which all three, we now have a pipeline where the Gates Foundation is the biggest funder that we'll see breakthroughs in all three of those areas. We have a vaccine trial, it's called M72, that's out in the field, very expensive trial. Wellcome Trust has come in as a partner to help fund that. And so TB gets ignored because it's only in poor countries.
Right.
TB, you have almost no cases in rich countries. So we have work to do there, but an incredible pipeline of tools that we should be able to drive that down. Yeah. We're not going for a total eradication, but we'd like to see more than a 90% reduction in that death rate.
It'd be amazing. And malaria.
So malaria is primarily in Africa. There's some in Asia, some in South America. Yeah. It kills right now about 600,000 a year. When we get started, it's more than double that. And this is even more unfunded than the other diseases because it's so much in poor countries. And, all those families who have children dying, they're poor enough that it's never a priority for profit-driven activity to make bed nets or drugs or a vaccine. So all the malaria tools work is funded either by governments or philanthropically, and we've been the biggest funder in that area with lots of great work. The bed nets are a big reason that we've had that 50% reduction. But every malaria tool, unfortunately, the mosquitoes or the parasite evolve around. And so you have to constantly renew. Like we had a first generation of bed nets, and then the mosquitoes got, so those bed nets didn't kill them. Right. And so now we have this second generation out that we brought the cost down very, very dramatically.
Yeah. And is there a climate element of malaria? And if so, what is it?
Well, as the world gets warmer,
Yeah.
malaria shows up in different locations. So in Africa, you look and you say, well, why aren't the big cities more on the coast? Every other continent, that's the case. It's because the lower you are, the more likely you are to have terrible malaria. So a lot of the big cities, take like, why in Kenya is it not the port? Why is it Nairobi? Well, it was higher up, so you had less malaria. As it gets warmer, the mosquitoes thrive at higher altitudes. And these mosquitoes are learning to live in cities now, so that's very concerning. Also, whenever you have a lot of water, say you have flooding, then the mosquito populations grow dramatically. So Pakistan, that usually has only thousands of malaria deaths, as they had flooding a few years ago, that went up by a factor of 20, and they were stunned because of that flooding. And so climate works against you, but you can win on this one, partly by having tools that reduce mosquito populations, partly by having better drugs, better vaccine. It's a mix of tools, and we do a lot of inside the foundation is an incredible disease modeling group, and we fund a lot of these groups outside the foundation to say, okay, what if we had a better drug? What if we had better bed nets? What if we dropped the mosquito population? To really say, okay, what is, particularly in the very tough places in Africa, what would you need to have a chance to get to zero?
Yep. As we talk about all this, I'm reminded that people mostly in academic circles, write about philanthropic foundations, and they have a term now, which they call the Gates approach. It is a way of running a foundation that at least some of these writers think is unique. How does your approach to all of this compare with what others do? Or what makes it different from everybody else?
Well, we don't want to be different, and we have lots of co-funders of the work we do who see, that you're saving lives for a very small amount of money, and as you save those lives, these countries can uplift themselves and become self-sufficient. Right. We are the most hands-on in the sense that, we've got the world's best tuberculosis team. Right. Sadly, nobody really competes with us on that. HIV, nutrition, family planning. Yeah. So we're able to hire people who had an incredible career in the farm industry and come and work on these diseases that don't have the profit potential, but have such a huge impact on human health. Yeah. And so they come and, we are very oriented towards understanding how to make very cheap things, very cheap vaccines, cheap drugs. And so it's a novel set of skills that, it's about 1,700 people work for the foundation. And so I built that as a top-notch innovation organization, based on everything I'd learned at Microsoft. But here, the goal instead of profit is saving lives. Right. And so that kind of deep expertise, were relatively unique. A lot of philanthropists appropriately say, okay, I'll have either none or very limited staff, and I'll find the actors that are out there and get money to them. In the areas we work in, there was no one to fund in malaria or contraception. And so we both built up internal capacity because in terms of hiring and managing innovators, I feel capable of that. I enjoy that. And then we help build up external organizations as well.
Yep. Would it be fair to say that the foundation is very data-driven?
Yeah, we're very data-driven. I mean, what other way is there to be? I mean,
Well, but maybe others don't do it as much as you do, or so I have heard.
Sure, but you don't need everyone to go off and do the analysis. But, you know, when I was asking in the late 90s, what do children die of? You know, there were only sketchy answers. The World Bank had funded the 1993 World Development Report that showed him roughly what they died of. But it was stunning how little was known. You know, I said, okay, what does the autopsy data say? And people laughed because the idea of autopsies, you know, getting the doctors and the expense, you know, it's not just not done. You take a few visible symptoms and you guess, and you don't really know what the disease was. So through a variety of efforts, funding a statistical group called the International Health Metrics, funding tons of studies, funding actually what we call minimally invasive autopsy, where even in these very poor countries, the majority of parents give permission to take some samples and actually figure out. And so now global health is very data driven. We know very well, okay, what are the missing vaccines? If we had that vaccine, how many lives would it save? We understand, you know, drug resistance and malaria. And so the global health has gone from being very naive to being a very data-driven, deeply understood thing, which, you know, is why we know what we should put research into. We know which tools we should get out in which countries, and we see when the delivery isn't working and how to change that.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the things that got you interested in this before the foundation was founded. I mean, this is the 25th anniversary, but you were getting interested in this before 2000. What were the origins of the foundation?
Well, of course, you know, I'm extremely lucky that my ownership of Microsoft became incredibly valuable. And my parents had incredible values of volunteering in the community and giving of their resources. And so, you know, both of my parents were always okay, you know, to whom much is given, much is expected. In fact, my mom said that when Melinda and I got married, that was one of the opportunities or challenges we'd have, was to give the money back. You know, and so once you decide what your own consumption will be and what an appropriate level for your kids is, you know, the balance is there for philanthropy. Warren Buffett had a cover story in Fortune before I even met him that said, hey, think carefully about how much you give to your kids, because it can actually, if you give too much, it can be a problem. And so Melinda and I, over the years, you know, came to a view on an amount that's generous by some measures, but percentage-wise quite modest, because this fortune, you know, has got very large. And so, yes, in the 90s, you know, even before we got married, we were talking about, okay, this would be important. And we really picked health in poor countries and education, starting with the United States, as our primary priorities. And so we were doing some giving in the 90s, hundreds of millions, not billions. But that was we were on the learning curve. You know, we gave $125 million for vaccines, and the vaccine people came and said, oh, we want to thank you for that. And they, you know, they were told, don't be begging too much. But I said to them, well, what would you do if you had more money? And the diarrhea guy talked about rotavirus, and the pneumonia guy talked about pneumococcus, and they were all, no, here's what we can do. And it was like, wow. In a way, I have to say, discovering that this money could save tens of millions of lives, it's kind of a tragedy, because it means that the world, with all of its resources, wasn't funding work on malaria and diarrhea. But it also meant for me that, okay, the Gates Foundation could make a dramatic difference, you know, just like big innovations that that I experienced at Microsoft here, even you could save lives for very limited amounts of money per life saved. And so the confidence of, okay, could we do work in health and education? It was gained by some grants done in the 90s. And then my dad and Patty Stonecipher are running the foundation. I'm still at Microsoft. In 2000, Steve steps up to be the CEO, but I stayed full time through 2008, and that's when I switched to be full time at the Gates Foundation and still doing some part time work for Microsoft.
Yeah. Some people might wonder, I think, obviously you are energized by all of this.
Absolutely.
You thrive on this. And for example, I'm reading your recent book, Source Code. And what comes through is how much you were drawn to mathematics, logic. At Harvard you take the hardest math classes. You may be up 24 hours writing code and stuff like that. It sounds like the ultimate left brain guy. And yet you have been captivated by the plight of little kids on the other side of the world. Is that a surprise to you or not?
Not really. I may seem externally because I'm very scientific or, a student and I love to learn things and I find that so fascinating, but learn for what reason? The reason you learn is to improve the human condition. And, so when I did software, I felt like, okay, this software's empowering, that's mostly a good thing. But then when I shift, the beauty of philanthropy is that it's not constrained by this profit motive. And I have to say, I was shocked at how little resources were going in to help in the poorest countries. And philanthropic money spent there, if it's spent decently at all, you're always going to have at least 20 times more impact than you can have in rich countries. There's lots of rich country philanthropy. We do a lot in education, but the resources are so limited, and the key public goods are so underfunded that, in terms of helping all humans, that money is going to go the furthest. And so, I learned about vaccines and got to meet, the incredible people who work in that field and built a team that's almost like a pharmaceutical company, but with lives saved as its bottom line.
You mentioned just a minute ago your father. I gather that your father had a significant role in the foundation, especially in the early years. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so both my parents were phenomenal, and I was very lucky with both of them. My dad was a lawyer and quite successful at that. My mom was initially mostly around the home, but doing lots of volunteer work, and eventually served on lots of boards. So, and they, they set the example. So I knew that, okay, if I was successful, philanthropy would be part of what I would do. I, served on the United Way board. I got Microsoft to do matching and a lot of payroll deduction, which they continue to be very strong in that to this day. Sadly, my mom died in 1994, so in less than a year after I was married, and so she didn't get to live to see the philanthropic work flourish. As my dad's legal career was winding down, it seemed great that he could set the culture of the foundation along with Patty Stonecipher. So they were, I think, co-chairman, and did a fantastic job getting things going. I would part-time look at various grants and understand what was going on. But they got it off to this incredible start, including my dad's way of looking at things, his values. We still give every year an award called the Bill Gates Senior Award to the person at the foundation who evidences those values for everyone else.
Day to day, week to week, what is your role at the foundation? You're the chairman of the board. You travel a lot. I've heard that you do. What are the decisions that you must make? How do you allocate your time?
Well, the overall strategy, in that sense, we're like a for-profit business. We do these reviews of the different groups, like the TB group or the HIV group. We devote 2 weeks a year. Mark Sussman is the current CEO, absolutely fantastic. And so he's there managing things. But this strategy review, it's he and I and the top team that he's built are going through and saying, okay, how's our diarrhea work going? How's our K through 12 education work going? And then we'll set out of that process, which is in the fall, we'll set the budget for the next calendar year. I travel about a third of the time. I go to rich countries because they're our partners in giving. I go to India quite a bit because there's a lot of amazing innovation that's both being invented there, but also being deployed there because they've put more money into health. I'm in Africa several times a year. We have a lot of very, very important relationships. I go to capitals, so I go to Washington, D.C., and encourage the Congress to stay generous to maintain things like PEPFAR and the President's Malaria Initiative and all the things that have allowed this field to make progress that I wish more people were aware of, because it is so profound in terms of sort of the report card for humanity.
Yeah. Obviously, the vast majority of the assets that the foundation has have come from you. But as you mentioned, of course, Warren Buffett donated a very large amount several years ago. And there's something else, the Giving Pledge. And the long-term effects of the Giving Pledge, I think, might be important, right? Why don't you explain what it was? Some people might not know. But I gather that you have sort of created a community of people that you may not even have expected.
Yeah, so when we were brainstorming with Warren about could we make it more fun for people to give? Could we encourage more people to give? The U.S. is slightly more philanthropic than other countries, but even so, at 2% of the economy, it's not as big as you might want it to be, since this money, there are things it can do that neither government or private sector are going to do. And so we got a bunch of philanthropists together and brainstormed about, should we pool money? Should we have a fundraising group? And, what came out is that philanthropy is pretty lonely. It's not clear how you learn from others. And your staff may develop their own agenda, and so you're always reluctant there. And how do you kind of let people who may come from different industries learn from each other's philanthropic successes and failures in a way where they're willing to be very candid? And yet, if we wanted to get philanthropists together, we wanted them to be committed. And so what evolved out of those discussions, where Warren played a very key role, was have people who are committed to give the majority of their wealth away, both have annual event where they learn from each other, but then also a series of more focused things like, okay, if you want to give to research or education, and we have dozens of those. Right. And so the Giving Pledge, got started with the hope that maybe we'd get 50 to 80 like-minded philanthropists.
Right.
Now it's far, far bigger than that. So it's you can never say really, unlike our work in malaria, where it's pretty clear that wouldn't have happened unless we come in to do that.
Right.
Giving Pledge, a lot of these people would have given anyway. So you can't really measure it. But I have to say, I've learned a lot and been inspired by the people in that.
Right.
I think, having philanthropists that are very far along in their giving journey, talk to some who are early in their giving journey, even if they're not working on the same cause. It's been, in my view, a phenomenal success, even though I can't give you any numbers of what it takes credit for.
Yeah, it's unknowable.
Right.
Right. But what a great thing, right? I mean,
No, it's been amazing.
It's incredible.
I look forward to that event every year.
Yeah.
The different styles and causes that people go after and the innovation, it's inspiring. We had one recently where you got to bring all your family members, and people talk frankly about who's running the philanthropy and how much they're giving to the kids and things. That was probably the best.
It reminds me of the idea that CEOs, especially big company CEOs, often feel that they don't really have anybody to talk to. And similarly, people who have a lot of money that they'd like to give away may not know who to talk to, and now they do.
Yeah, and philanthropy is almost by definition harder than other things because these are unsolved problems and you don't have the feedback of profit that tells you, oh, you're doing a good job. And if somebody's a grantee, the chance they'll say to you, wow, giving money to me was the most brilliant thing you've ever done. You have a little bit of bias in the system that only, by being pretty tough-minded about outcomes, okay, what outcomes are you going for? How are you going to measure that? Connecting with fellow travelers is I think, encourage people to do more sooner and hopefully in a smarter way.
Yeah. I gather it's not a secret that you have combined with certain philanthropists, I'm thinking of Michael Bloomberg, Ray Dalio maybe, on projects and on topics that you are both interested in. Can you give us an example?
Well, Michael Bloomberg's a phenomenal philanthropist, and he's been a huge supporter of the polio work, huge supporter of contraception work. We have, I'd say, a dozen things that we do together, and we're constantly talking and I'd say scaling that stuff up. Ray Dalio and I have said, okay, how do we encourage philanthropy? We created a group in China that will help drive philanthropy there. Yeah, so I'd have a hard time because I'll forget to mention people. Chris Hahn, who does Children's Investment Fund. We have found people, including lots of people in the technology industry, but not just there, that we work on projects together. Some, just show us how they do their work. Like John and Laura Arnold, they go about things in a very careful, efficient way. So, I feel like I've learned a lot from them, although we haven't done any gigantic joint projects together.
Right. There are some interesting elements within the foundation that I bet people don't really understand. One, the strategic investment arm, where you actually help for-profit companies with their business by investing in it, because it will enable the foundation to do things, right?
Right. So, we'll often do like a purchase guarantee. So, for example, the drugs being used for HIV, what were called first-line therapy, they were drugs that had side effects, and you had to take them literally every day. And we saw that we changed that formulation, that you could get the price down and get the side effects down. Anyway, it would be a lot better. But because these are generic drugs, there's nobody to spend the tens of millions to optimize for this new combination. And so we had to fund the trials and make a gigantic purchase guarantee. I think that was $500 million. And so that the generic makers would make that switch. And it's been just phenomenally successful because the purchases did switch over, and now we have that much better drug. We also, for biotech companies in particular, but educational technology companies, we can go in and say, if we invest, not only do we get some equity, but either for kids in the inner city or for developing countries, we get access to your invention at very limited or no cost at all. It's called a global access license. And so a great example of that is we funded BioNTech, German vaccine company, to work on mRNA vaccines. It was actually DARPA, part of the Defense Department, and Gates Foundation, who were part of the early funding of that approach, because we saw it could make very cheap vaccines. That was a great one because not only did they make a great COVID vaccine partnering with Pfizer, they're now a key partner for us for HIV, malaria, and TB vaccines, and our investment also made money. So it's kind of a, a perfect example of what we try to do to encourage innovation.
Yeah, there were no setbacks. That was all good.
Yeah, I mean, we also invested in another company, CureVac, which is a great company.
Yeah.
But their COVID vaccine did not work. So it's not a 100% hit.
Right. But if you aren't having mistakes, then you aren't doing enough.
Right. And overall, partly because biotech's had a good period, we have a return on that. That was not our primary goal. Our primary goal is to get access to technologies that can create very low-cost medicines, and that's where the biggest impact has been.
Yeah. And one other thing that I've learned and that I didn't know anything about was that people send the foundation money, right? I mean, others are happy to fund some of this themselves.
Yeah, so we have a group, of entity, Gates Philanthropy Partners, that can accept donations. There's really two things there. One is sometimes people know the work we do and either in their will or some other way just provide resources, and that's been great. Sometimes that vehicle goes after a specific cause like women's contraception, and it's the easiest way to pool money is to through that entity. And so yes, we've had hundreds of millions there, and it enhances our work.
Yeah. One thing we haven't talked about so far is the U.S. project that the foundation has, where it's all about American students getting through secondary school and some kind of post-secondary school. Is that the idea? And what's the rationale there?
Well, our education work is one of the two big pillars. Both Melinda and I had incredible educations that we feel allowed us to succeed and that should be available to everyone. And so looking at the U.S. education system, we funded early on a look at dropout rates. And, it was kind of phenomenal how dropout rates had gone up, both dropouts from high school and then even for kids who get into higher education, a very, very high dropout rate, higher than any other country, and not a great situation where you might have even borrowed money, but you don't end up getting the degree. And trying to say, okay, given that it's not a normal type of market, are there high schools or colleges that add to the earnings power of their students way more than others? I I mean, if you just take good students, yes, they earn a lot of money, but it's not necessarily your value added.
Right.
It's taking kids and really getting them trained. And so this idea of, okay, where is education in America working and where is it not working? We also did a lot of scholarships. We gave over $1 billion. It's a program still ongoing where we find kids who wouldn't be able to go to a college or a very good college and make sure that there's money for them. They're called Millennium Scholars, and when I'm traveling around to colleges, I get to meet these kids and hear about their stories.
Probably a very rewarding thing to do.
Absolutely, and if those kids, by setting an example, can help the communities they come from, then the impact can be pretty dramatic.
Yeah. And what have you found about what is effective for students getting through secondary school and then on to something else?
Well, there's a lot of great things that have happened in education, but it's important to say that the overall metrics, there's no equivalent to cutting the death rate in half in global health. Global health, the field that we're a big part of and helped energize, has been wildly successful, even though it's not well known. Right. U.S. education, there have been some great wins, but overall, the level of math skills or reading skills or even these dropout rates have gone down somewhat, but not as much as you would like them to. And, particularly if you compare the U.S. to other countries, they continue to progress, and we've been pretty plateaued for a long time. We've funded some incredible charter school work, and you can go there and see the students who are benefiting from that. And even some charter schools, if a state isn't really careful about how they manage it, sometimes there are charter schools that are not better. Right. And the whole point was to say, hey, we'll give you a lot of freedom, and if you do better, you have permission to keep going, but if you don't, you should not get the state's resources.
Right.
We've done a lot with curriculum. Mm-hmm. The curriculum in the U.S. is now way more coherent in terms of really preparing you for the various tests that you take. It used to be a lot of states didn't have the right material in the right order to help you take things like the SAT and ACT and this thing called the Common Core, which, although it was controversial, has basically been adopted everywhere. Right. The name was changed in a few places. But this is, when you go online to learn math, this is the progression that the online resources assume. So that has been good. So a lot of good things, including now taking AI and creating personal tutors with partners like Khan Academy. And that is showing great promise.
Yeah. There are an awful lot of fairly young entrepreneurs now, almost all tech entrepreneurs, but who have a lot of money already. And they are, let's hope, the next generation of philanthropists. Do you talk to them? Do you observe them? Do you have any sense of what might motivate them, what they would like to do?
Well, certainly there are exemplars like Mark Zuckerberg, through the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative is committed to give over 90% of his wealth away, and he's off to a very good start. He's someone I talk to about a lot of things, including philanthropy, and they do education research. We partner on some of that. They do medical research that connects up with some of our work. We're very outcomes driven. They're very research driven, and so it's kind of complementary. Yeah. The tech sector, although it's not as philanthropic as I'd like it to be, it is one of the most philanthropic sectors. You don't ever think when you run a tech company, hey, my son will run this company and my grandson will run this company. We're kind of dynastic, so we can't give it away. That although there's skill involved, there's some element of luck, and so your sense that, gosh, this should go back to people. And so there are dozens and dozens of tech entrepreneurs in the Giving Pledge doing amazing giving. And, there are people like Ron Conway who talk to all the tech entrepreneurs, and in the US at least, and try to get them thinking even early in their career, okay, start small, but, this is something that will be very fulfilling. The 3 Airbnb founders are ramping up their philanthropy, being incredibly thoughtful about it. So they're, a great example.
In a number of countries in the U.S., but also in other countries, there is less wish to do what we call foreign aid. And I have to imagine that affects the operations of the foundation. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're very clear that, particularly on the delivery,
Right.
we are a partner.
Yeah.
And unless the rich countries stay generous,
Right.
then the progress is going to stop and may even go into reverse. And so, telling these voters, hey, you should be proud of this, it is moral, it serves a lot of benefits, I'll be doing my best to articulate that, but it's harder to project how far we'll get in 20 years because of this unknown variable, where we've seen, as budgets are tight, as you want to put money into your Ukraine, the money for saving lives right now is going down somewhat. It's up to us to make that case and make people aware that this money is very well spent. Foreign aid, you can pick some extreme case, often not even true facts, but there are some cases where it's not well spent. It's a few percent, but then that, means that voters are less willing. So, a lot of my time will be, telling the truth about foreign aid and trying to keep it to be generous. But that uncertainty means that how much we'll achieve in the next 20 years, that's probably the biggest unknown, is do our fellow travelers stay generous, or do they kind of tune out these millions of deaths and turn inward?
Yeah. Yeah, and the one other topic that we just didn't get to is, there are critics of large philanthropic foundations, and they say, gee, they're too powerful, are having large effects on certain countries, which, may be good, but the argument is, well, but still, the people of those countries don't vote for or against the foundations that come in. I'm sure you've heard it. What do you make of it?
Well, there's some critiques I agree with. I would make the tax system in the U.S. more progressive than it is. And so I and other billionaires, we'd have less money to give away. So that, philanthropy is your money that you have after you pay your taxes. And so that disagreement over what the tax system should be, it's kind of separate. Yes, I've been left with more money than my tax system would have. And then you get really legitimate criticism. I mean, because, we're picking this malaria construct or this TB construct, we can make mistakes. And so the idea that people are out there saying, no, that's wrong, you should be doing this, that's really very good.
Right.
I would love to have 10 times as many malaria critics and malnutrition critics, because these are very, very lonely fields. How can a disease that kills millions of children have so few people involved in it? It's, we're like 10% of the dog food industry is this. A lot of our diseases, we take drugs that were developed for rich world dogs, and then we say, oh, wow, they actually work on humans in Africa. So it's a windfall from being nice to the dogs, which is fine. So, we're not, a voter in, say, like the World Health Organization. We do believe in technology, like we stick up for vaccines. Of course, all of our vaccines go through these, incredible safety trials, and now that, has come under attack. Yeah. So you really have to parse out these things. Not many people would say, no, I wish he was buying a yacht. The world would be so much better off, and he would do such a good job of that. And, but, I want to be, very open-minded. Every grant we give, of course, is completely public. Our assessment of, what's working, what's not. All these health metrics we've pulled together in this thing called the Global Burden of Disease, which I wish everybody would spend time and be fascinated by that.
Yeah.
All right.
Fantastic.
Well, thanks for coming down.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, very much.